เคล็ดลับสอบ TOEFL iBT ให้เสียงโดยอาจารย์ดร.ธนพล ลำดวนจาดใจดีและ
Jennifer Allery
Ryan Kirshner
Rachel Kirshner
Mark Gary Track 1 Planetary Atmospheres. We are starting to run around the solar system a lot these days. We've been to the moon and we're sending our robot spaceships. Well, that's what they are. We're sending them all over the place. We're talking about sending men to Mars and so on. So before we start zipping around all over the solar system, we'd better find out whether we can breathe the air we find on any of the other planets. Those robots have been sending back reports, and what they're saying is that there isn't much in the way of breathable air on any of the other planets. When I was your age, I read of lots of science fiction stories about people going to Mars and Venus. If you're reading any science fiction these days, you know they're not set on Mars and Venus. They're on the fifth planet of Aldebaran or some such. That's because science fiction writers know what the robots are telling us about the air on other planets in the solar system, and so do the readers. And the readers wouldn't believe the stories about breathable air on Mars. So let's start at the inside and go out. What's the planet closest to the Sun?
Mercury.
Right on the nose. You wouldn't expect Mercury to have much of an atmosphere. And you'd be right. It's too small and too hot. We sent out Mariner 10 to find out about Mercury. Anybody know what it found? It found we could make an atmosphere like Mercury's in a laboratory right here on Earth. And if we did, we'd call it a vacuum. That's right, there isn't any atmosphere on Mercury to speak of at all. What's the next planet out?
Venus
Bingo! Give that girl a big cigar. Venus is about the size and mass of Earth, so it's big enough to have an atmosphere. And what an atmosphere! The atmospheric pressure at the surface is 90 times the Earth's. To find pressure like that on Earth, you'd have to go 1 kilometre down into the ocean. And does anybody know what Venus's atmosphere is made up of? It's 96.5% carbon dioxide. Our plants would go wild in air like that, but we couldn't breathe it at all. Besides carbon dioxide, there's 3.5% nitrogen. That adds up to 100%. Actually, there are 5 other gases, but they don't amount to much. Let's skip the Earth, because we all know all about that, don't we? So onward to Mars. 3 missions to Mars have measured the atmosphere. Mariner 9 and Viking 1 and 2. The air there is very thin, about 1% of Earth's pressure. It's just about as much carbon dioxide as Venus's, 95.3%. By the way, don't worry about the percentages. I won't ask them on the test. Where was I? 95.3% carbon dioxide. The rest of it is nitrogen, argon, water vapour and rare gases. There's a lot of guff going around about life on Mars. I don't think so. All that carbon dioxide could mean plant life, but there's almost no oxygen at all. And oxygen is what plants exhale. So if there were any plants on Mars, they'd be exhaling oxygen. No oxygen, no plants. And no animals, because animals need oxygen to breathe. Now on to Jupiter, which we don't know as much about because none of the spaceships have been into the atmosphere there. Track 2, Planetary Atmospheres. We're starting to run around the solar system a lot these days. We've been to the moon, and we're sending in our robot spaceships. Well, that's what they are. We're sending them all over the place. We're talking about sending men to Mars and so on. So before we start zipping around all over the solar system, we'd better find out whether we can breathe the air we find on any of the other planets. Those robots have been sending back reports, and what they're saying is that there isn't much in the way of breathable air on any of the other planets. When I was your age, I read a lot of science fiction stories about people going to Mars and Venus. If you're reading any science fiction these days, you know they're not set on Mars and Venus. They're on the 5th planet of Aldebaran or some such. That's because science fiction writers know what the robots are telling us about the air on the other planets in the solar system. And so do the readers. And the readers wouldn't believe the stories about breathable air on Mars. Track 3, Symphonies. All right, gang. We talked about concertos last week. Today we're starting on symphonies. Anybody know what the word symphony means?
It's a kind of orchestra, isn't it?
You're close. One kind of orchestra is called a symphony orchestra. But what I'm asking is what the word itself means.
A symphony is a piece of music comprising at least 3 movements.
Aha! You've been memorizing the dictionary. That's okay. But what I'm trying to get at is this. SYM is Greek for together, as for instance in sympathy, which means feeling together. PHONY is Greek for sound, as for instance in telephone, which means far sound.
Is that the same as phony, meaning fake?
I'll let you stay in class, but that's got to go. So the word symphony means sounding together. When you apply it to a symphony orchestra, you're saying that all the instruments of the orchestra play together. When you apply it to a musical work, you're saying that it has several movements and they all fit together to make one total impression. Now, does anybody know who wrote the first symphony? That's right. Nobody knows because that depends on what you mean by symphony. There was a work published in Antwerp in 1585 called Symphonia Angelica, but that was a collection of madrigals.
Aren't madrigals things that are sung?
Yes. So at that time the word clearly meant any kind of music, vocal or instrumental or both, performed by an ensemble, anything from a duet on up. Gradually, the word became limited to instrumental music, especially to music performed in Italian operas. The Italian word for symphony is sinfonia, and there was a sinfonia for 3 flutes in an opera first performed in 1600. It was written by Jacopo Peri, but don't write that down. It won't be on the test. Write down Claudio Monteverdi, 1607.
What happened then?
Monteverdi was the first important composer of Italian operas, and he included no fewer than 5. Count 'em. 5 sinfonias in his opera Orfeo, which appeared in 1607. Now, who was the second important composer of Italian operas?
Scarlatti?
That's right, Alessandro Scarletti, and he contributed to the development of the symphony. Anybody know how? He used sinfonias as the overtures to his operas. He used the term Sinfonia avanti l'opera, symphony before the opera. And his overtures were in 3 movements, fast, slow, fast. The first one came in 1681. As Italian opera became popular all over Europe, the fast, slow, fast overture became used by composers in other countries as well. In France, for instance, Rameau used the form in an opera in 1749.
How do you spell Rameau?
Rameau. So the form was developing in the 18th century. But while the form of the symphony was taking shape at that time, the word itself was also being used for all sorts of other pieces of music. For instance, Bach's three-part inventions were called sinfonias. And what Handel called a pastoral symphony in the Messiah isn't what we'd consider a symphony at all. Anybody know who wrote the first real symphonies that weren't overtures to operas?
Haydn?
Wrong, but that wasn't a bad guess. The first real symphonies were written by a man you've never heard of, Tommaso Albinoni.
What was his date?
1735. He published a book of 6 symphonies in 1735. As we'll learn later on, the sonata form is an important element in the development of the symphony, and the third movement of Albinoni's 5th symphony is in the sonata form.
What's the sonata form?
It uses contrasting keys. At first the keys are opposed to each other, but by the end of the movement they're reconciled. It starts with a theme in the tonic key, followed by a different theme in the dominant. Usually these contrast in instrumentation, loudness and texture. Then, by the end of the movement, they're reconciled in some way, usually by reshaping the two themes somehow in the dominant key. Well, after Albinoni, other Italians began writing symphonies. I'll give you the names, but you don't have to remember them. Giovanni Martini wrote, believe it or not, 77 symphonies. Some of these, by the way, have 4 movements instead of 3.
That's a lot of symphonies, but it still isn't as many as Haydn.
Right. The next name is Giovanni Martini, also known as the inventor of the drink that bears his name. Nah, I was only kidding. He wrote 24 symphonies. Now, one important thing about Sammartini and Martini is that Mozart was familiar with their work. He heard Sammartini's music on a visit to Milan, and in 1770 he visited Martini in Bologna several times.
Was that how the symphony got to Austria? By Mozart's acquaintance with Italian music?
No, and you've got to remember that Haydn came before Mozart. A Bohemian composer named Stamitz had an orchestra in Mannheim, Germany, that was big enough to be considered the first real symphony orchestra, and he himself wrote 70 symphonies for it. There were other German composers as well who wrote symphonies. The most important was Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, one of Johann Sebastian Bach's sons. C.P.E. Bach's symphonies are especially important because they show a lot of humour, technical challenge and novel harmonies. His instrumentation was especially clever.
What were his dates?
His first collection of symphonies appeared in 1773 and his last in 1780. C.P.E.'s brother, Johann Christian Bach, the London Bach, also wrote some 50 symphonies, very elegant. Mozart met him in London in 1764 and Paris in 1778. But the most influential influences on Haydn, Mozart and Beethoven were a group of composers in Vienna, the most important being Karl Ditters von Dittersdorf. Von Dittersdorf wrote 115 symphonies and was a close personal friend of Haydn's. The Viennese composers went all over Europe, even as far as Dublin and St. Petersburg, and one of them even went to what later became the United States. So, now we're ready to talk about Haydn. Track 4, Symphonies. Aha, you've been memorizing the dictionary. That's okay, but what I'm trying to get at is this. SYM is Greek for together, as for instance in sympathy, which means feeling together. PHONY is Greek for sound, as for instance in telephone, which means far sound.
Is that the same as phony, meaning fake?
I'll let you stay in class, but that's got to go.
Track 5. Office visit.
Hi, Professor. Can I come in?
Sure, Lynn. Come on in and have a seat.
Are you busy?
That's a loaded question to ask a professor when the legislature thinks if you're only teaching 9 hours a week of classes, you're not busy enough. You're not going to tape record my answer to that, are you?
No, you don't have to worry about that.
Well then, I'm not so busy, but I can't talk with you. What's on your mind?
I need some advice.
What about?
Well, I think I must be doing something wrong. I study for your tests, and I think I do a good job, and I know all the facts, and then I get a B on the test. I thought maybe you could give me some pointers on how to study better.
Well, I don't know. Do you have your blue book with you?
Yes, I do.
Give it here. Yes, I think I see it.
See what?
See what your problem is. It isn't that you're not studying hard enough. It's that you don't know how to answer an essay test. I think if I gave an objective test over the same material, you'd probably get an A. You know the material, but you don't know how to put it together.
I don't understand.
Look, in a class like math, for instance, there's a right answer and a wrong answer. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is the right answer. 2 plus 2 equals 5 is one of a number of wrong answers. So in mathematics, you need facts, you need information.
You have to know the method, the procedure too, so you can work the problems.
Well, that's true. Okay. Well, anyway, in a math class you can give an objective test. I guess maybe math would be a bad example. Let me start over again. In some subjects, the important thing is the information, the facts. You agree with me so far?
Sure. I remember in my intro to psych class, the first test was over just defining the terms.
Right. So in a class like that, you can give an objective test, true or false, multiple choice, and so on. Are you still with me?
Sure.
In this class, we're one step, well, maybe more than one step beyond that. You have to know the facts. You've got to have the information, but that's just the start. You have to see how the facts relate to each other, how they go together to make a picture. I guess what I'm trying to say is that in this class I'm trying to get you to think.
I don't know.
Take this question for example. Discuss the importance of bacteria to life on Earth. Your answer is full of information about bacteria, but you don't pull the facts together to answer the question.
I don't understand.
Well then, let me show you how you should have answered the question. Discuss the importance of bacteria to life on Earth.
I guess I don't know what discuss means.
It just means talk about. I used it because I didn't want to load the question, to give away the answer. What do you think? Are bacteria important to life on Earth?
Well, sure.
Okay, then you need to start your answer by saying bacteria are important to life on Earth because. If you didn't think they were important, you'd start out bacteria aren't important. Or bacteria have very limited importance, or something like that. But you think they're important, so you should start right out. Bacteria are important to life on Earth because, and then you follow it up with your reasons. Why do you think bacteria are important to life on Earth?
Well, for one thing, they make the soil fertile.
Right. Now you say that, or words to that effect, toward the end of your answer. But it ought to be right up at the front. Bacteria are important to life on Earth because they make the soil fertile. Okay, what else?
Well, they help the dead matter to decay, dead plants and animals.
Right. I can see that you know the facts, you have the information, but you didn't put it together in your answer so that I could tell that you saw the significance of the facts. Do you understand now?
I think so. I should have started out. Bacteria are important to life on Earth because they make the soil fertile. They help dead plants and animals to decay, and beneficial bacteria kill other forms of bacteria that are harmful. Then I should have, what's the word?
Develop. You should have developed those 3 points by using the examples from all that factual information you learned.
I understand. Thanks a lot. You've been a big help.
Just one more thing.
What's that?
Without bacteria, we wouldn't have yogurt to eat.
That's right. Well, thanks again.
That's what I'm here for. Come in any time.
So long.
Track 6.
Question 1. During your working life, you will have to work with many different kinds of people. What personality traits are especially important in a coworker that you can get along well with?
Track 7.
Question 2. People who like to get up early and get going in the morning are called day persons. People who like to get up late and work into the night are called night persons. Which are you, a day person or a night person?
Track 8.
The writer of this editorial in the student newspaper makes some good points, but he overlooks the enormous complexity required in adopting the policy he advocates. The university has dozens of subject fields, taught by hundreds of instructors and professors, and it would be impossible to set a single homework policy which would suit a subject like English, where students do much writing, one like mathematics, where they do much computation, and one like history, where they do much reading. Students write, compute, and read at different speeds. It is more practical for each student to be in charge of budgeting his own time, scheduling some time for classes, some for sleep, some for recreation, some for social interaction, and some for homework.
Question 3. The man disagrees with the editorial in the student newspaper. State his opinion and the reason that he gives for holding that opinion.
Track 9.
The Thai family of languages is one of the most important in Southeast Asia. The languages in this family are spoken by more than 80 million people in 6 countries: Thailand, Laos, Myanmar, Assam in northeastern India, northern Vietnam, and southwestern China. The languages use 2 different writing systems. The languages in the north and central regions write in Chinese characters. The use of this writing system goes back at least 300 years, though of course that may mean only that all the earlier manuscripts have been lost. In the southern areas, where most of the Thai speakers live, they use a writing system based on the Indian writing system, used in Sanskrit and so forth. This system goes back at least 800 years, so it's much older than the script used farther north.
Question 4. The point is made in both the reading and the lecture that Thai-speaking people in the northern areas use a script based on Chinese characters. Given the geographical spread of the Thai family of languages, why does it seem reasonable that this should be true?
Track 10.
Reading The Merchants of Venice really hit me that Shakespeare knew his onions.
What do you mean?
We'll take that Shylock. He was a real nasty character, but Shakespeare lets us see how he got that way.
You mean that the Christians pushed the Jews around?
Yes, you know, that got me to thinking about race in the good old US of A. We white folks talk about how the blacks are all criminals and drug addicts and such, but how did they get that way?
I get it.
And now we've got all the Muslims against us.
Well, not all of them.
enough of them to be a problem anyway. So what did we do to them to make them hate us so?
Well, what?
I don't know, but I think we ought to be asking ourselves. I wonder what Shakespeare would say if he was alive today. I bet he'd write a play where there was a mean, nasty Muslim and let him speak out about why he was that way.
Maybe, but I wonder whether he meant to take Shylock the way you're taking him. If he was alive today, I'd ask him if that was what he really had in mind. Question 5. A man and a woman are talking about a character in a play written about 400 years ago. The woman feels that the character's portrayal is relevant to social problems in our own day. If she is right, then in the course of history similar problems arise over and over again. Do you think she is correct? Why or why not? Track 11. Meat, eggs and dairy products are the principal sources of protein. Cereal grains provide a little protein, but chiefly carbohydrates. Both protein and carbohydrates provide energy when you eat them, but carbohydrates provide a little more, and besides, grains are easier and cheaper to grow. That's why in the poor parts of the world most people eat mostly grains with very little meat. The two major cereal grains used in food are wheat and rice. Wheat's most commonly used in North America, Europe and northern India. Rice is the most common grain in East and Southeast Asia. There are nutritional problems caused by processing both wheat and rice. When wheat is milled to produce white flour, it loses vitamin B. That's why it's better to eat whole wheat bread. There's a similar problem with rice. When rice is milled to produce polished rice, it loses thiamine and riboflavin. That's why it's better to eat brown rice. The funny thing is that in many Asian countries, most people ate white rice and got sick, and brown rice was fed to prisoners, so the prisoners were the healthiest part of the population. Nowadays, both white wheat flour and white rice are fortified with vitamins, so both grains are healthier than they used to be.
Question 6. Using points and examples from the talk, explain why wheat flour and wheat rice are currently fortified with vitamins.
Lecture 1, Track 12.
Folk arts and crafts. Now, I'm not an expert on Thailand's folk arts and crafts, but I've been to Thailand, and I've been to the center at Bang Sai that your textbook talks about, and I bought stuff at an OTOP store, and I think your textbook pushes things a little too far. Now, don't get me wrong. I think both the Bang Sai Center and the OTOP program are good, and I think I bought some good stuff at both places. And as far as traditional, I think both programs use traditional designs. But I think it's stretching things to say they're preserving folk arts and crafts. But let's go back to what we said earlier in the class about oral transmission. Your textbook talks about that too, but I think it misses the point. Take a song, for example. You have a singer who makes a song and he starts singing it in a community. Other people in the community learn it, and also he passes it along to his children and grandchildren, and that goes on for generations. The OTOP program comes close to that because it's based on community. But in folk song, what's the result of that process of oral transmission? Everybody who sings the song sings it differently. They forget some words and substitute new ones, or they think they can improve it and add something. In fact, even the person who composed the song in the first place, even he sings it differently every time he sings it. So you get a whole batch of variant versions of the songs. And even in OTOP, where are the variant versions? You go into an OTOP store, and there are some very nice things, very beautiful things, very delicious food. But row on row, they're all alike. I'll bet you dollars to donuts that somewhere in that community, they have a high school class in whatever it is the Tambon makes, and some teacher is training those kids to turn out a batch of identical products. That isn't folklore. That's what Richard M. Dorson called fake lore. And at Bangsai, it's even worse. Even your textbook admits that those folk artists at Bangsai take on apprentices and teach them. Now that isn't the way folklore is transmitted. Folklore is transmitted from father to son, not from teacher to student. It's transmitted within a community, and those apprentices at Bangsai come from all over Thailand. They do great work. I'm not denying that. I'm just saying that if you're going to talk about folklore, you've got to have a rigid enough definition that some things are inside it and other things are outside. We're up against the most basic problem in what they call preserving folklore. You preserve a fruit by cutting it up, cooking it down, adding some sugar to make a syrup, and calling it pineapple jam or strawberry jam. And the reason you do that is because pineapples and strawberries both spoil. They get rotten. So if you don't preserve them, you have to throw them away. And the only reason you have to preserve folklore is that it's dying out in the culture. So you keep it alive artificially. You boil it down, add a little sugar to make a syrup, and put it in a jar, so it will still be there and taste good next year.
Track 13. Television Technology. Okay, you're watching TV. Let's say it's a Western movie with two guys shooting at each other. They're hiding behind rocks, and every once in a while one of them pops up from behind his rock and takes a shot at the other. You got that? Okay, but think of what you don't see. That desert that fades away into the background of the scene is painted on a big sheet of canvas. You don't see the edges of it. You don't see the camera that's shooting the scene. You don't see the cameraman behind the camera. You don't see the director sitting in his canvas chair deciding whether things are going okay or whether he ought to stop the scene and start over. You don't see the other actors sitting in their canvas chairs, watching the scene and waiting till it's over so they can shoot their scene. When you watch it on TV, the camera frames what you see. If you were there in person, you'd see all this other stuff. So what's the camera doing? It's taking what it sees and turning it into electrical impulses. It's scanning that scene into a series of dots, 525 dots wide and about 390 dots high. We call the dots pixels. It scans each scene twice into some 400 horizontal lines that we call fields. It does this twice, 200 fields, and spaces them, and then another 200 fields that fill in the spaces. That seems like it would take a lot of time, but the camera is scanning really fast. It scans 50 or 60 fields a second and then puts them together in one picture that it records on tape at 25 or 30 fields a second. 25 or 30 fields a second. You can't see anything that fast. When you look at something, your brain retains that image for 1/10 of a second. That's 10 images a second. So the television camera is recording what it sees 2.5 or 3 times as fast as you can see it on your TV screen. And that's why what you see on the screen looks like a continuous action, with these two cowboys taking shots at each other. Come to think of it, television is a really marvellous invention. It's amazing. And remember, we've just been talking about the video portion. At the same time it's doing all that, the TV camera is also recording the sound, the audio portion. It's recording the bang every time one of those cowboys gets off a shot, and the whine of the bullet, and the ping when it hits one of the rocks. Track 14. Well, troops, we're going to start right at the beginning. How many of you know right now how a computer works?
I don't know, Prof. I just turn mine on and it goes from there.
I think that's the way most people think of their computers. But it's a lot more complicated than that. Let's start with the Central Processing Unit, or CPU, also called a processor, or sometimes a uniprocessor, to distinguish it from multiprocessors. But let's leave that for later and stick with one CPU. The CPU is on a computer chip, probably made out of ceramics. How fast it works determines how fast your computer works. Yes, you have a question?
I've heard a lot about computer chips, but I can't visualize what they're like. You say they're made out of ceramics. I think of ceramics as things like vases and little statuettes.
Okay. The terminology is a little fuzzy here, because a chip is also called a microprocessor and an integrated circuit, depending on what aspect of it you're talking about. Physically, the computer chip is about the size of your thumbnail. I see you're all looking at your thumbs. Each chip has been imprinted with maybe millions of transistors. Do you know what a transistor is?
I have a transistor radio in my dorm room.
Right. Radios used to be very big because they used vacuum tubes, but then somebody miniaturized the vacuum tube into a transistor, and people kept getting them smaller and smaller until you can imprint millions of them on an area the size of your thumbnail, together with the wiring to connect them. The transistors and the wiring that connect them are all printed on the chip as one unit. That's what the term integrated circuit means. And the chip is called a microprocessor because even though it processes all those instructions and all that data, it's so very, very tiny. Intel made the first chip in 1971 it was, I think, and it had 2,300 transistors on it.
Wow!
If you think that's a wow, the Pentium chip that Intel brought out in 1993 had 20 million transistors on it. And IBM brought out a chip in 2001 with 170 million transistors.
How many transistors are on chips now?
New chips are coming out so fast that I can't keep track of them. Now, these are only the microprocessor chips, the ones that have the CPU, ALU and cache on them. There are memory chips too, and they have more than 1 billion transistors, but we're getting off track. Let's get back to what the CPU does. The CPU consists of a control unit and an arithmetic logic unit, or ALU. The control unit is what tells the computer what to do. It contains the operating system. The main operating system in use today for personal computers is Microsoft's DOS, DOS, which stands for Disk Operating System. Apple uses a different system, its own system, and there's a so-called open source system, Linux, that's gaining ground. Network systems usually use Unix, an operating system developed by a company called Novell. Mainframe computers use other operating systems, mainly the systems developed by IBM.
How do you spell Linux and Unix?
Linux and UNIX.
What about Windows?
Windows isn't really an operating system. It's just an adjunct to DOS that provides enhanced graphics. Okay, so much for the control unit of the CPU. The ALU, the arithmetic logic unit, does two things. One is that it performs the simple arithmetic functions, add, subtract, multiply and divide. That's really where the computer started, actually. The early computers were built simply to compute, that is, to calculate numbers faster than anybody could do it with pencil and paper. That's why a computer is called a computer. Those early computers were pretty much like your pocket calculator, only a lot bigger. Alright, that's the arithmetic part of the arithmetic logic unit. The logic part is that it performs some simple logic operations, such as either A or B, and both A and B. So much for the CPU. The computer also stores instructions and data in its memory. There are three parts of the memory. One is the cache. That sounds like C-A-S-H, which means money. But this is C-A-C-H-E, and it means a place where you store valuable stuff. The cache is very small, but it's even faster than the RAM. and it's used to store information that you use often or need right away. The cache is usually on the same chip with the CPU. The second part of the memory is the random access memory, or RAM, spelled RAM. This stores the instructions and data that the computer is using right now, or has been using recently. It's very fast, and it's on a ceramic chip like the CPU. The third part of the memory is the read-only memory, or ROM, spelled ROM. It's much slower than the RAM and more permanent. It's on your hard disk, which is a magnetic storage device. If you want to save any data outside your computer, you put the rest of the ROM on removable magnetic storage devices, what used to be called floppy disks, though they're not floppy anymore. They include diskettes, which aren't used much anymore, and CDs, which stands for compact discs. So there's your basic computer, the CPU and its memory units. But in order for it to be useful, the computer also has to have peripherals, also called input-output units, or I/O units. Data has to be put into the computer so the computer can use it, and that means input units. The keyboard is one kind of input unit. Another is a program. These all used to be on CDs, which functioned as an input unit. A few programs are still on CDs, but more often nowadays they're downloaded off the internet. Programs are mostly instructions telling your computer what to do. They're more advanced than the logic section of the ALU because they're written to include conditional instructions.
What's a conditional instruction?
A conditional instruction sets up the conditions under which a certain operation takes place. It says, if X, then do Y, but if no X, then do Z. That's important because then what the program does depends on the results of what it's done before.
Are keyboards and programs the only kinds of input units?
No, an optical scanner is another kind of input device.
What about VCDs?
Good point. VCD stands for Video CD, and a lot of people play VCDs on their computers. So far as that goes, you can play just an ordinary music CD on most computers, and also DVDs, which stands for digital video discs. These are all input devices. The most basic output devices are monitors, printers, and loudspeakers. The monitor is like a television screen, which is also called a monitor, and it lets you see what is going on in your computer. Well, a small part of what is going on. The printer lets you print out what shows on your monitor, and you use the speakers when you play your CDs, VCDs, and DVDs. So, for instance, if you wrote a paper for this course, you typed it on your keyboard, which is an input unit, and you put it into a word processing program like Microsoft Word. Microsoft Word stored it on your hard disk until you needed it, and then you brought it up onto your monitor, printed it out, and handed it in. Track 15. Well, troops, we're going to start right at the beginning. How many of you know right now how a computer works?
I don't know, Prof. I just turn mine on and it goes from there.
Track 16.
Now we turn to the topic of how organisms adapt to their environments. I'm sure all of you can think of examples of how animals adapt, yes?
Polar bears are white.
Right, and that is an adaptation to environments because...
Because they live in the snow.
Yes, indeed. Very good. Anybody else?
Tigers have stripes because they live in the jungle, and there are a lot of shadows from leaves and things.
Good. We'll talk more about animals next week. But today, I want to turn your attention to something that maybe you haven't thought about. How about plants? How do plants adapt to their habitats? I can see that we're moving into a new territory here. Okay, Does anybody want to hazard a guess as to what characteristics of a habitat determine the adaptation of a plant?
Rainfall?
Yes, rainforests have much different flora than deserts. Anything else?
Temperature?
Right. Sticking to rainforests, the rainforests in temperate climates, like those in Washington and Oregon, are much different from the tropical rainforests that most people call jungles, like those in Brazil and Indonesia. And of course, temperature is influenced by latitude, so we can consider latitude one of the factors as well.
How about altitude?
Certainly. As you go up the side of the mountain, you can see how the flora changes. First, you find the deciduous trees, and then those thin out and you find the trees that keep their leaves, or rather their needles, all year round. And there are other factors as well. Actually, habitat has more influence on plants than on animals, because when the climate changes, for instance, an animal can move, but a plant can't. We'll go into all this in more detail tomorrow, but today, I want you to start thinking about this whole issue by giving you some examples. Birch trees, for instance. You find birch trees all across the temperate zone of the northern hemisphere, and geologists are interested in that because it's part of the evidence that a land bridge once existed connecting Siberia with Alaska. And there are other plants with the same geographical distribution, for instance, primroses and buttercups. All these plants are found together in the same kind of environment, all the way from the Netherlands to eastern Canada, showing that they've adapted to the conditions of their habitat. In tea, you find tea plants growing from the eastern Himalayas through northeastern China and eastern Siberia to Taiwan, Japan, and Sakhalin Island. There's this band of territory where the conditions are just right for tea, and this band is also the area where the tropical rainforests to the south are blending into the deciduous forests to the north. Laurel and Magnolia trees have just about the same distribution. This is a good example of how rainfall affects flora because you go west along the same latitudes and you come to the desert region that stretches from the Caucasus Mountains to Tibet. Tea doesn't grow there, I can assure you, nor will you find laurel and magnolia trees. The typical trees in that area are willow and spruce trees, of course, are not deciduous. You go a little farther north into northern Europe, and you get conifers stretching from Iceland in the Atlantic all the way across the Bering Strait to Canada and the northern United States until you reach the Atlantic again in Maine. Pine and fir trees are common to both continents, but you also get some local variations, such as the redwood trees in Northern California. But then you go south and you find palm trees. There are 35 different varieties of palm trees in the islands of Polynesia.
Professor?
Yes?
You've given us all these examples, but you haven't got down to specifics. Why are there so many different kinds of palm trees in Polynesia?
Aha, good question. And that's exactly how we're going to spend the next 2 weeks, going into all the specifics, first about plants and then about animals.
Track 17.
Sticking to rainforests, the rainforests in temperate climates, like those in Washington and Oregon, are much different from the tropical rainforests that most people call jungles, like those in Brazil and Indonesia.
Track 18.
As you go up the side of the mountain, you can see how the flora changes. First, you find the deciduous trees, and then those thin out, and you find the trees that keep their leaves, or rather their needles, all year round.
Track 19. May I come in?
Of course, Samrut. Have a seat. How are you getting along this semester?
Oh, I'm doing okay this semester, but I'm looking at the schedule for next semester, and I'm confused about the graduation requirements. I thought that since you're my advisor, you could give me some advice.
Well, that's what advisors are for. What's the problem?
I can understand why I have to take the required English courses, and I don't mind the science requirement, because when I graduate, I may go into a company where some science knowledge would be useful.
What about the social science requirement?
I can meet that with economics, and that will help me in business too. But I don't see why I have to take things like literature and history. That'll never help me in business.
Well, the easy answer to that is that you never can tell what will come in useful someday. But I don't think you'll be satisfied with the easy answer. The reason we have the general education requirement, which is what you're talking about, is that it's important to the aims and goals of the American education system. We have an ideal of the well-rounded person.
Well-rounded?
Yes, there are other educational systems which are narrowly focused on turning out graduates who are experts in one particular area, but don't know anything about anything besides this one field. We say they know more and more about less and less, until finally they know everything about nothing.
But I don't understand.
The American system, on the other hand, is intended to produce well-rounded individuals who know a little about many things, as well as being an expert in one field. You're objecting to having to know something about history and literature, right?
That's right.
We'll take history. You're living in today's world, but today's world is just the result of things that happened in the past. And in order to understand today's world, you have to know how it got that way. One thing to bear in mind is that America is a democracy, which means that American citizens have to make a lot of decisions about the way they want their country to go. They can make better decisions about the future if they know how the present has been shaped by the past. To say nothing of the fact that a lot of mistakes were made in the past, and if they know what those mistakes were, they won't be inclined to vote for leaders who'll make the same mistakes again.
But the history that's taught here is American history and world history, and what they call world history is mostly the history of Europe.
You're right. We don't do enough about the history of Asia. But even so, American history and world history can help Oriental students. In the first place, there are parallels between what happened in the West and what happened in the East. It takes a little effort for you to spot those parallels and see what they can teach you about Asia, but you can do it. And in the second place, what's happening in Asia today is heavily impacted by Western culture and Western institutions. Don't you see that in your own country?
Well, yes. Okay, I can see history, but what about literature?
That's easy. Literature is about people and the relationships between them. It helps you understand other people. It'll help you be a better manager.
But psychology is about people and the relationships between them.
Right, but its approach is abstract and general. It tells you things that you understand with your brain. Literature tells you the same things, but you understand them with your emotions.
Well,
I can see you're not entirely convinced. Go home and think about it for a while, and if you're still having a problem with the required courses, come back and we'll talk about it some more.
thanks. Track 20. I can understand why I have to take the required English courses, and I don't mind the science requirement, because when I graduate, I may go into a company where some science knowledge will be useful. Track 21.
We'll take history. You're living in today's world, but today's world is just the result of things that happened in the past. And in order to understand today's world, you have to know how it got that way. One thing to bear in mind is that America is a democracy, which means that American citizens have to make a lot of decisions about the way they want their country to go. They can make better decisions about the future if they know how the present has been shaped by the past. To say nothing of the fact that a lot of mistakes were made in the past, and if They know what those mistakes were. They won't be inclined to vote for leaders who'll make the same mistakes again.
Track 22.
Professor,
Yes?
I want to express an objection.
All right, go ahead.
A group of us have been talking, and we don't think we ought to have to read Huckleberry Finn. We think you ought to assign us another novel.
Aha! A group of black students, I suppose.
That's right.
And what's the reason for this objection?
Well, the novel uses a 6-letter word that we find very offensive.
The N-word.
That's right.
Well, the reason I assigned Huckleberry Finn is that it's one of the 2 greatest American novels of the 19th century. The other is Moby Dick. And Huckleberry Finn is more important than Moby Dick because of the influence it had on later writers. Ernest Hemingway said that all of American literature could be found in Huckleberry Finn. And while I think that was an overstatement, he had a point. Huckleberry Finn was the first really American novel, and it marks a dividing line in the history of American fiction. The reason for that is that it was the first novel written in American English, or I guess I should say it was the first novel written in the American language rather than English. All the writers before Mark Twain were writing English novels laid in America. Hawthorne, James Fenimore Cooper, all of them. But Mark Twain wrote an American novel in the American language, and I guess that's the reason for your objection.
I'm not sure
Look, Twain doesn't specify the locale of his book, but it's clearly in Missouri on the banks of the Mississippi River. That's where he himself grew up, in a little town called Hannibal. Hannibal is in Marion County, Missouri. Anybody know where Marion County got its name? It was named for General Francis Marion, one of the great heroes of the American Revolution. One of the great Southern heroes of the American Revolution. So the cultural milieu where Twain grew up and where he laid Huckleberry Finn is a Southern milieu. Which means that in the years before the Civil War, politically it was a pro-slavery milieu. And the language of Huckleberry Finn reflects the language of that area. You go down the Mississippi 2 counties and you're in Pike County. How many of you have heard the old American folk song, Sweet Betsy from Pike? 1, 2... Well, when I was in college, we sang old folk songs, I guess more than students do nowadays. Well, Betsy came from Pike County, and when she left out for California in the gold rush, she took with her Yalla dog, Yalla for yellow. That's just one example of the way people from that part of Missouri talked. It's the way Mark Twain himself grew up talking. And it's the way he wrote Huckleberry Finn, because Huckleberry Finn is written in the first person by Huckleberry himself, a barely literate teenager. So much for the locale. Now look at the timing of the book. Twain doesn't tell us the year that the action takes place, but it would be some time in the late 1830s or early 40s, before the Civil War. There was still slavery in America then. In fact, one of the 2 main characters in Huckleberry Finn is a slave who's running away, and Huck helps him to run. In that time, in that place, the only word that anybody, white or black, would have used to describe Jim, the slave, is nigger. Yes, Jim is a nigger.
I don't have to sit here and listen to you use that word.
All right, I won't use it again. I'll call him black. But Twain wouldn't even have thought of calling him black. He was writing about a specific place and a specific time, and he was using the language of that place and time. Not even Al Sharpton could deny the historical accuracy of Huckleberry Finn. Now, what is Huck's attitude towards Jim? I guess that's a rhetorical question, because you haven't read the novel yet. Huck is a white boy, and he comes out of the lowest social milieu there is, His father's the town drunk. He's poorer than poor. So he comes from the social class just one notch above slavery. If you know your American history, you know that that's the class that would be most threatened by freeing the slaves, because then the freed slaves would become competitive with them. But Huck defies the social mores of his time, maybe because he's still young and hasn't been completely socialized yet. He likes Jim. He feels sorry for Jim, so he helps Jim escape. And as they go rafting down the river together, his affection for Jim grows. He sees Jim not as a... Oh, sorry, I forgot. I promised not to use that word. He sees Jim not as a black man, but as a human being. And that's one of the great points Twain is making. Twain's lashing out against racial prejudice. So you see, Huckleberry Finn is on your side. There was still racial prejudice in America in 1884, 20 years after the Civil War, when Huckleberry Finn was first published, so it was relevant to Twain's first audience. And I'm sure you black students are even more aware than I am that there's racial prejudice in America even today. We saw that when Barack Obama ran for president. So Huckleberry Finn is still relevant, and that's another reason for reading it. Not just because it's an American classic, but because it has something to say that it's important for us to hear. If we close our ears to the book because of the language it uses, we're missing an important message. Track 23. Well, the reason I assigned Huckleberry Finn is that it's one of the two greatest American novels of the 19th century. The other is Moby Dick. And Huckleberry Finn is more important than Moby Dick because of the influence it had on later writers. Ernest Hemingway said that all of American literature could be found in Huckleberry Finn. And while I think that was an overstatement, he had a point. Huckleberry Finn was the first really American novel, and it marks a dividing line in the history of American fiction. The reason for that is that it was the first novel written in American English, or I guess I should say it was the first novel written in the American language rather than English. All the writers before Mark Twain were writing English novels laid in America. Hawthorne, James Fenimore Cooper, all of them. But Mark Twain wrote an American novel in the American language, and I guess that's the reason for your objection. Track 24. All right, I won't use it again. I'll call him Black. But Twain wouldn't even have thought of calling him Black. He was writing about a specific place and a specific time, and he was using the language of that place and time. Not even Al Sharpton could deny the historical accuracy of Huckleberry Finn. Track 25. Today we're going to start talking about motivating employees. In the old days it used to be that nobody worried about motivating employees. The boss's attitude was, my way or the highway. If you asked what were the benefits of the job, he said, you get to go home at the end of the day. But things have changed. Bosses nowadays have learned that employees aren't interchangeable, and if you get a good one, you need to hold on to him. Or her. And bosses are always on the lookout for good people, because good people make the boss look good. So if you have a good employee, somebody may hire him or her away from you. Can anyone suggest some things that are motivators?
Money.
Yes, of course money is one of the motivators. Salary and bonuses. And along with money, of course, are the benefits. Things like hospital insurance and a 401 plan. But the research has shown that money isn't the most important motivator. Far from it. What do you think the most important motivator is?
Promotions.
Good working conditions.
Those are two good motivators, and let's consider them for a moment. But they're not the most important motivator of employee behavior. I'll tell you what that is in a little while. Let's talk about promotions. What we're talking about here is advancement in rank. A promotion by itself is just a change of titles. It doesn't mean anything unless something more tangible accompanies it.
A raise.
Yes, a raise, an increase in salary. But there are other things as well that could go with a promotion that make it more motivating. For one thing, a private office. If you've been out on the floor with your desk just one of 20 or 30 other desks, getting a private office can be pretty motivational. If you already have a private office, then getting a larger one, or one with a better view, is highly motivating. Another thing is getting a personal secretary. If you've been calling in somebody from the steno pool every time you need to write a letter, having a personal secretary is very motivating. Then a secretary can answer the phone for you and screen your calls. And she can, he or she can keep your appointment book. And he or she can remind you of things that you might forget.
And pour your coffee.
You can pour your own coffee. Professor, what about job security? Is that a motivator?
It sure is, but there isn't very much of it around these days. Downsizing, mergers, acquisitions. All these things have torpedoed job security. It used to be you got hired by a company right out of school and stayed with that one company until you retired. Not one worker in 1,000 can do that now. Okay, we talked about promotions and the things that might go with it. You mentioned working conditions. Those can be very important motivators, and there have been a lot of studies on the effect of some very novel innovations. We'll talk about specific case studies later. Right now I want to just cover the topics. One obvious improvement that can be made in working conditions is lighting. People work better if they can see what they're doing. The lighting shouldn't be too dim or too glaring. Another motivating factor in working conditions is the ability to personalize your own workspace. Even if you only have one desk out of 24 desks on the floor, you need to feel that it's yours. Pictures of your husband or wife, pictures of the kids, a souvenir of that trip to Disneyland, whatever. Anything that gives you a sense of ownership. Now there are a couple of new things, innovations, that have been tried recently and work like a charm. Anybody know what job sharing is? This is more attractive to women employees, working moms that want to have some time at home with the kids. Or women, men too, that have some kind of health problem that means it's hard for them to work full time. So you hire 2 part-time employees. A woman with kids comes in when the kids are off to school, say 9 in the morning, and then goes home at noon to do the housework and be there when the kids come home. And then a man with some kind of medical problem comes in at 1 and picks up where she left off.
Doesn't that make for problems in continuity?
The studies indicate that that's not too much of a factor. What it does do is require good communication between the job sharers. When the woman leaves, she writes out detailed instructions of what's left undone, and the man does the same at the end of the day. Of course, I was just using that as an example. It could be 2 women or 2 men. Anybody heard of flexi-time? Flexi-time is short for flexible time. That means the employee selects his own working hours, depending on what goes on in his life outside. As long as they add up to 40 hours a week, there's no problem. Let's say that a woman is a good pianist and has a part-time job playing dinner music at a restaurant. She has to get there by 5 o'clock, so she needs to leave the office at 4. Well, she can come to work at 8 in the morning, and 8 to 4 adds up to as many hours as 9 to 5. Again, that's just an example. We'll get into some case studies later. Another motivating factor in working conditions that isn't really new but has been growing in popularity is freedom from what's become called micromanagement. The old style boss used to say, "It's my way or the highway." In other words, the boss set the goal and then told the employee in detail how to reach it. It's far more motivating to tell the employee, "Here's what I want you to achieve. How you achieve it is up to you." Here's another innovation in working condition that's been used to good effect as a motivator. It's employee participation in decision making. Bosses aren't the only people with good ideas, and sometimes the people who do the work are better at knowing how to do it. That's Dr. Deming's innovation. We'll go into all that in detail later. My own experience with that is that the company I was working for got a project from the Department of Defense that had to be done yesterday, if not sooner. It meant 14-hour days for everybody on the project until it got done. 7 days a week. I got my people together to tell them about it. I didn't tell them, "This is what you've got to do." I told them, "The DoD has given us this job. How are we going to do it?" They came up with the plan themselves. And they were much happier working those 14-hour days because it was their idea than if I'd told them, "This is what you've got to do." But so far we haven't mentioned the best motivator of all, the one that all research indicates is the most important, the most effective. I'll give you a last chance to tell me. Anybody have a guess? It's praise. If you really want to motivate an employee to do his best work, praise him when he does it. Sorry again, let me rephrase that. If you want him or her to do his or her best work, praise him or her when he or she does it. On a scale of 1 to 10, that's the 10. Money's at 1. The reward that people will work hardest for is simply attaboy or Track 26. Here's another innovation in working condition that's been used to good effect as a motivator. It's employee participation in decision making. Bosses aren't the only people with good ideas, and sometimes the people who do the work are better at knowing how to do it. That's Dr. Deming's innovation. We'll go into all that in detail later. My own experience with that is that the company I was working for got a project from the Department of Defense that had to be done yesterday, if not sooner. It meant 14-hour days for everybody on the project until it got done. 7 days a week. I got my people together to tell them about it. I didn't tell them, "This is what you've got to do." I told them, "The DoD has given us this job. How are we going to do it?" They came up with the plan themselves. And they were much happier working those 14-hour days because it was their idea than if I'd told them, "This is what you've got to do." Track 27.
Come in, Mr. Malik. What can I do for you today?
I'd like to arrange for a refund of my food service fee.
Well, there really isn't a food service fee. You pay for your food service as part of your dormitory fee. But why do you want a refund?
Most of the food that's served at the dormitory I can't eat, so I get up early and go downtown to eat breakfast at an all-night restaurant, and I eat lunch and dinner at a cafe that serves Lebanese food. I believe that since I'm not using the food service facilities in the dormitory, I shouldn't have to pay for them.
I see your point, but since the university doesn't make a separate charge for food service, I don't see how we can make a refund. Tell me, why can't you eat the food in the dormitory?
There are 2 reasons. One is that for religious reasons I cannot eat pork. Every morning the breakfast served in the dormitory contains bacon or ham. And for the other meals I cannot be sure that the dishes do not contain pork. I cannot be sure that the fried foods are not fried in pig fat.
I see. What's your second reason?
In my country, the food is extremely spicy and flavorful, and I find the food in the dormitory very bland and tasteless.
Yes, I can assure you that some of the American students make the same complaint. Institutional food is never as good as home cooking. For one thing, everybody's taste is different, and the safe thing to do is not to use any seasoning at all and let each person add the seasoning he wants. Well, let me see. Your first reason was that you can't eat pork, and the dormitory serves bacon and ham at breakfast. Can you just put the bacon and ham on the side of your plate and eat the rest of the food?
I'll go hungry if I do that. I will not get enough protein, and the rest of the food is not palatable to me.
Yes, I can see you have a difficult problem, but so far, as going hungry is concerned, I know that the servers in the dorm cafeteria have orders to give second helpings to anyone who asks for them. So if you don't eat the bacon and ham, you can get a second helping of eggs and toast. And eggs are a good source of protein.
I think the eggs may be fried in pig fat.
Well, you can get them boiled or poached, but I can assure you that the cafeteria uses only vegetable oil for frying. We're very conscious of students' health here, and we don't want to add to the cholesterol problem of any student. So we use only sunflower oil, and that takes care of your first problem. Now, as to the second, you find the food bland and tasteless.
Yes, madam.
I think you can solve that problem yourself by buying some of the spices that you're used to in your home country and adding them to the food in the dormitory when you eat it. There are some food stores in town that cater to persons from foreign countries, and I'm sure that some of them will have the spices you're used to. That will be cheaper for you than eating all your meals in restaurants. I can see by your expression that you're not entirely pleased, but there's no way we can refund your food service fee, because there isn't any such thing separate from your dorm fee. On the other hand, we have a great many international students, some from the same part of the world that you come from, and I think we can make some effort to accommodate your tastes. I'll talk with the food service director and see what we can come up with. For one thing, we can label the food items that do contain pork so that you and the other students of your religion can avoid them. And I'll ask the food service director whether she can vary the menus a little so that each meal there's something that our international students will recognize. Not always from your country, but once or twice a week from your part of the world. I don't think we've solved your problem completely, but I hope we can make things a little better for you.
Thank you, madam.
And thank you for coming in to see me. I think as a result of this meeting, we can make things just a little bit better for the international students on our campus. Everything else going all right for you?
Yes, madam.
Glad to hear it. Come in to see me anytime you have a problem.
Track 28. Today we're going to talk about how we see colour. I've put up on the wall a poster of Britney Spears. I don't care what you think about her personal life or her singing. I put her up there because I think she's an attractive young lady, and the picture gives us something pleasant to look at. We're going to consider the mechanism of how we actually see that picture. Now, to begin with, how many colours do you see in that picture? Don't bother trying to count them. The answer is 4. Yes, I said 4. That poster was printed by a 4-colour printing process, and the 4 colours of ink that the printer uses in any colour printing are cyan, which is a kind of greenish blue, magenta, which is a kind of purplish red, yellow and black. Just 4 colours. And the combinations of those 4 make all the other colours you see.
How about white? Is that the absence of color?
In the printing process it is, but to our vision, white is the combination of all the colours.
In school, they told us that the 3 primary colors were red, blue, and yellow, and purple, green, and orange were combinations of those.
That's close enough. And what you've named are the colours of the rainbow: red, orange, yellow, green, blue and purple, which some people call violet. Those are also the colours of the spectrum, which is the range of colours you see when you pass white light through a prism. Some people see a seventh band in the rainbow, between blue and purple. They call that indigo. I don't see it myself, but maybe that's my problem. Actually, you can demonstrate that there are hundreds of colours, each with its own wavelength, but our eyes are constructed so that we sort them into those 6 bands. And the bands overlap, so that red shades into orange, orange shades into yellow, and so on. Actually, this is to some extent culturally determined. People in some different cultures see a different set of colours. They really see the same things we do, but they may divide them up differently and give them different names. The purple you see on that poster is a combination of cyan and magenta. The green is a combination of cyan and yellow, and the orange is a combination of magenta and yellow. But as you can see, there are an infinite or almost infinite variety of colours in the poster. Her hair is yellow, but there are a lot of different yellows in her hair. Her lips are a kind of red, but there are a lot of shadings of that red. What makes all those shadings is the variety of intensity of the colours that went into the printing process. Now, how do we see that poster? Could we see it in the dark?
Not very well.
I could turn out the lights in this room, but that wouldn't give us absolute darkness, because light would be coming in from the windows. If I could bring about absolute darkness in this room, you wouldn't be able to see the poster at all. The less light you have, the less colour you can see. The more light you have, the more colour you can see. You can see in dim light, but you can't see colour. So light is necessary for us to perceive colour. That's important. Write that down. Light is necessary for us to perceive colour. What is happening right here in this classroom at this very moment is that light, the light from the lighting fixtures, the light from the windows, light is striking the poster and bouncing off into our eyes. Now that brings up the question, what is light? Can anybody define light for me? Good, that's the right answer, because light is one of the few things that can't be defined by anything simpler than itself. Light is a kind of electromagnetic radiation. Electromagnetic. That is, it's the same kind of radiation as electricity and magnetism. Light is a form of energy, just as electricity and magnetism are. One of its unusual characteristics is that it's constantly in motion. Once it stops moving, or isn't light any longer, if it hits anything solid, it doesn't stop travelling. It just bounces off and keeps going. The exception is that if it hits something absolutely black, black absorbs it and it stops travelling. You can think of light travelling through space at a constant speed, almost 300,000 kilometers a second, in the form of quanta. Quanta is plural. Singular is quantum. Q-U-A-N-T-U-M. Do you know what a quantum is? A quantum is a little packet of energy. It's like a wave, except that it's also like a particle. Or you can say that it's like a particle, except that it's also like a wave. Since it isn't only a wave, or only a particle, it's called a quantum. I guess that's better than calling it a wavicle. Then people might get it confused with an icicle. The quanta of light are called photons, to distinguish them from other kinds of quanta. Every beam of light, and there are an infinite number of them all around us all the time, every beam of light has its own frequency, measured in cycles per second, also called hertz. H-E-R-T-Z, hertz. It also has its own wavelength, expressed in terms of nanometers. 1 nanometer is 10 to the minus 9th power meters. Light, as I said, is a form of energy, and the amount of energy each beam has is measured in electron volts. The higher the frequency, the greater the energy, and the higher the wavelength, the less the energy. Violet light has the lowest wavelength, about 400 nanometers. You go below violet in wavelength, beyond ultraviolet, and you get X-rays, gamma rays, and cosmic rays. Red light has the highest wavelength, about 700 nanometers. You go above red, you get heat, infrared rays, microwaves, and radio waves. Television is in there too. These rays of light bounce off things we see, travelling as you might expect at the speed of light, and enter our eyes. We get more information through our eyes than any other way. Not very many of us have ever looked inside our own eyes, so I'll have to tell you what you'd find if you did. You'd see a lot of things, but what we're interested in today is that you'd see a collection of cones. Cones. C-O-N-E-S. They're called cones because that's what they look like. Well, there are 3 kinds of cones, one for each of the kind of colour they absorb. What they see is blue, violet, green and red, depending on the wavelength of the light that stimulates them. If all 3 kinds of cones are stimulated equally at the same time, what they see is white.
If all they see is blue, green, and red, how do we see yellow?
I'm sorry, I was talking too fast. The cones that see blue-violet can also see yellow. And the cones also distinguish light and dark, all the way from white to black.
What about people who are colorblind?
One or another set of cones doesn't work. So people who are colorblind may be red-green colorblind or blue-yellow colorblind. Very rarely there are people whose cones don't work at all, and they see everything in shades of grey, like a black and white movie. Now let's look at Brittany again. Her lips are red. There are some differences in the kind of red, caused by the shadows, but aside from that, her lips are red. Anybody disagree with that statement? Let me see hands of those that disagree. All right, everybody agrees. Now, how can we prove that the red that I see is the same as the red that you see? Right again. There's nowhere in the world that we can prove that. You see light at a wavelength of 700 nanometers, and I see light at 700 nanometers. But there's no way under the sun that we can determine whether your brain processes that light in the same way that mine does.
Speaking section.
Track 29.
Choose a historical person and explain why you admire him or her. Please include specific examples and details in your explanation.
Track 30.
If you had purchased a music VCD which is defective, would you prefer to complain in writing or in person? Use specific reasons and details to explain your answer.
Track 31. What do you think? You going to sign up for it?
I'm thinking about it. What about you?
I'm tempted. I think it would be a snap course, but I hate to think of giving up all my Tuesday and Thursday afternoons.
I don't think it would be a snap course at all.
No? Just sit there and watch a movie and talk about it.
I don't think it would be like that at all. I had Modern Civ from Greenleaf, and he makes you put out the work. His tests are pretty tough.
I don't know. What could he test about over a movie?
If I know Greenleaf, he'll think of something. Besides, I like movies. I like to watch old movies on TV. Some of those old actors were really good. There aren't many actors in the new movies I've seen lately that are as good as them.
I don't know. The old movies I've seen didn't have enough fast action in them for me.
Well, suit yourself. I'm going to sign up for it. I can't think of a more fun way to learn about the history of the 20th century.
Well, I'm going to pass on this one. Track 32.
In this question, you will read a short passage on the academic subject and then listen to a talk on the same topic. You will then answer a question using information from both the reading passage and the talk. After you hear the question, you will have 30 seconds to prepare your response and 60 seconds to speak. Now read the passage about biochemistry. You have 45 seconds to read the passage. Begin reading now.
Track 33.
Now listen to a lecture on this topic.
Wilhelm Geisinger, a German psychiatrist, said that all mental illness is disease of the brain. Well, we haven't found that to be totally true, but we have found that some types of mental illness will yield to medical treatment. Not many, but a few. The most common one used to be what was called general paralysis. But then we found out that it was caused by the spirochete bacterium, and it was a form of neurosyphilis. So as we found drugs that were effective against syphilis, the incidence of general paralysis in the mental hospitals declined markedly. And there are neurotransmitters in the brain, such as norepinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin. These activate or inhibit the neurons that transmit impulses in the brain, and abnormal concentrations of these neurotransmitters can affect people's emotions or thinking. There are antidepressant, antipsychotic, and anti-anxiety drugs that work on the neurotransmitters. That's one thing about psychiatrists. There are a lot of different kinds of psychotherapists, but only psychiatrists are also MDs, so they're the only psychotherapists that can prescribe medicine. I don't know whether you've ever read any of the novels of Kurt Vonnegut, Jr. I'm not going to say that he was crazy, but if you've read any of them, you have to agree that the mind that constructed those novels saw things differently than the minds of most people. I'm thinking especially of The Sirens of Titan and Slaughterhouse-Five. Well, Vonnegut's mother was insane and was committed to a mental hospital, and whenever Vonnegut wrote about his mother, he mentioned that the chemicals in her brain weren't balanced properly. I don't know the specifics of her illness, but obviously Vonnegut thought it was caused by an abnormally high or low concentration of one or more of the neurotransmitters. And maybe, I don't put this forward as anything more than a hunch, maybe he inherited that abnormal concentration and was able to avoid going insane himself by putting his abnormal feelings into his books.
The professor describes the biochemical causes of mental illness. Relate this to the use of biochemistry in diagnosing and treating disease in general.
Track 34. In this question, you will listen to a conversation. You will then be asked to talk about the conversation and to give your opinion about the ideas presented. After you hear the question, you will have 20 seconds to prepare your response and 60 seconds to speak. Yes, Mrs. Strongram. What can I do for you this afternoon?
Well, Dr. Baker, I've come to you for advice.
I'll do what I can. What's your problem?
Well, I'm thinking about becoming a student here.
That's hard for me to consider as a problem.
No, please don't make fun of me. I'm quite serious.
I'm sorry. Please go ahead. Tell me your situation.
Well, I guess I'll have to be honest about all this. I'm 45 years old. I always wanted a college education, but I got pregnant just out of high school, and it wasn't possible for me to go on to school then.
I understand.
Thank you. Well, my youngest child has grown up now, and I don't have as much to do at home, so I thought maybe I could fulfill that old ambition of mine.
I think that's very commendable of you.
But I don't know whether I can do it or not. Since you're the dean of students, I came to you for your advice.
I can assure you, you won't be the oldest student on campus. We have others older than you.
That's reassuring, but I still have my doubts.
Suppose you tell me about them.
Well, I'd be in classes with students young enough to be my children. I think I'd feel ill at ease with them.
I think you might for a time, but I think you'll find they accept you.
I hope so, but I think I'd feel out of it. They have their own interests, and I don't think I'd fit in. And I think they know so much more than I do that I feel out of place.
I don't quite understand. How would they know so much more than you do?
Dr. Baker, I graduated from high school 27 years ago. The only education I've had for the last 27 years has been from the television and the newspaper. And I know a lot has happened in all that time that those kids have learned in high school, and they know so much more than I do.
All I can say to that is that I don't think our students have learned all that much in high school.
No, I'm serious.
I'm sorry for being flippant. Let me be more serious. We require all our undergraduates to take a course in American history. We know very well that they took American history in high school, but we know how shallow most high school American history classes are. You took your high school American history class 27 years ago, and you've doubtless forgotten some of it. But the kids who took American history last year have forgotten some of it too. And if you've been watching TV news and reading newspapers for 27 years, you probably know more recent history than most of our undergraduates. But tell me, what do you intend to major in here?
That's another thing. I don't know. I think I want a degree, but I don't know what I want a degree in.
That's one reason why we require students to take what we call general education courses. We want them to sample all the fields of knowledge so that they can decide what they want to concentrate on.
But whatever I decide to major in, I'll be almost 50 by the time I graduate. Can I get a job?
We certainly can't guarantee that for any of our graduates. All I can say is that some of our older graduates have found satisfying positions. But let me ask you something. I'm curious. You're asking about a job after graduation. I assume you support yourself. How can you support yourself as a student?
When my husband died, he left me very well fixed.
In that case, you don't have to worry about choosing a major that would lead to a remunerative position. You can pick any major that seems like fun to you.
The woman and the dean of students discuss her problem. Describe the problem, then state what you would advise the woman to do and explain why.
Track 35.
You will now listen to part of a lecture. You will then be asked a question about it. After you hear the question, you will have 20 seconds to prepare your response and 60 seconds to speak.
Write down this date. September the 1st, 1914. No, that wasn't the day World War I broke out. It was the day that the last passenger pigeon died. That's an important date because when the passenger pigeon became extinct, it started the environmental movement as we know it today. There had been billions of passenger pigeons. Every year they migrated north in the spring, south in the fall. When they migrated, there were so many of them that they darkened the skies for days. People used to go out and bang away at them and send freight cars full of them to restaurants in the cities.
Didn't they do a lot of damage to the crops?
Not much. They were ground feeders. If you just put seeds in the ground, they'd be interested in them. But once the seeds sprouted, the passenger pigeons would ignore them. They ate mostly worms and bugs, so the farmers that killed them were killing a bird that ate some of the insects that ate the farmers' crops. The passenger pigeons nested in trees, maybe about 100 to the tree. Around 1870, they began to thin out pretty rapidly. By 1914, there was only the one left in the Cincinnati Zoo, and on September the 1st it died. Now, the passenger pigeon wasn't the first bird to go extinct. The dodo, of course, is famous. People say, as dead as a dodo. By coincidence, the dodo was a kind of pigeon, only it was flightless. It lived on the island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. It went extinct in 1681. The moa was another bird that went extinct at about the same time. It was a ratite, like the ostrich, the emu, the ray and the kiwi. When the first English settlers landed in New Zealand, they found some small species of the moa, but the Maoris told them that there used to be big ones. The Maoris had hunted the big ones to extinction toward the end of the 17th century, and the English finished off the small ones by the end of the 19th. But it took the passenger pigeon to kick off the wildlife conservation movement. People began to say that we didn't have any right to kill off an entire species of animal. They said that animals had as much right to live on the earth as we do. And the movement spread from the United States all over the world. Many countries now license hunters and restrict what animals they can hunt and when they can hunt them. Nowadays there are even international treaties protecting some animals that live in more than one country, like seals. Marine mammals like whales and saltwater fish. Freshwater fish are mostly left to the individual countries to protect and conserve. Africa is a particular problem these days because many of the central governments can't exert much control over the rural areas. There are 25 species of primates, apes, monkeys and so on, in danger in Africa. The Democratic Republic of Congo is a special problem because of the civil war going on there. But in many parts of Africa, people hunt the primates for food. Hunting is a major cause of extinction, of course, but there are other factors. Primates that are in trouble in another part of the world are the gibbon and orangutan in Indonesia. There, the problem isn't hunting, it's shrinking habitat because of logging in the forests and the spread of farmland. In the United States, the prairie dog is in danger because much of its habitat is being turned into farmland. Habitat loss is a problem for bats too. 1/4 of all species of mammals are bats. They exist everywhere except the polar regions, and they're in trouble everywhere.
Using points and examples from the talk, describe the importance of the extinction of the passenger pigeon and the main reasons why species today are being faced with extinction.
Writing section. Track 36. Now listen to part of a lecture on the topic you just read about.
Let's say we're going to build a new classroom building for this university. We'd have to take into consideration first how big it was going to be. How many classrooms? How many faculty offices? The rule of thumb is 4 offices for every classroom, because a classroom is used every hour during the day. But a faculty member with a teaching load of 9 hours a week will use that classroom for only 2 hours, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and an hour and a half, Tuesday, Thursday. And how big will the classrooms need to be? If you've got sections of beginning courses with 25 students to a section, that's one thing. But if you're anticipating lecture classes of 100 or 150 students, that's another. Then you have to consider the type of class that's going to be held in the building. If you're going to teach chemistry, you need laboratories. If you're going to teach theater, you need at least 1 stage. All those things have to be taken into consideration. But you don't have to be an architect to figure all of that out. You can be an academic dean or a vice president for academic affairs. Once we've got that figured out, the next step is what materials we're going to use. We want to make this a sturdy building that'll last 50 or 100 years, perhaps indefinitely. When the Martians come in 1,000 years and explore this planet, we want this building still standing. So we want steel girders capable of a stress load of X pounds per square inch. We want to select facing that will not deteriorate, whether rock or concrete or whatever. We want a roof that will not collapse, and so on. But you don't have to be an architect to figure those things. An engineer can do that. And so far, all we have is a building. Just a building. We don't have a piece of architecture yet. Now comes the architecture. We want a building that will make people say, "Wow," when they drive past it on the highway. We want a building that will make parents say, "I want to send my kid there," when they see a picture of it in the university brochure. We want a building that will make a student say, "I want to learn," when he goes to his classes there. And for that, we need an architect. So the architect needs to consider how much space the building is going to cover, and how to put the building together so that it will still be standing 1,000 years from now. But the architect needs to know more than that. He has to know as much about education as an academic dean, and as much about stress ratios as an engineer. But he also needs to know how to design a building so that it's a work of art.
คำศัพท์ที่ใช้ทั่วไปในมหาวิทยาลัยในอเมริกา
Commonly used campus vocabulary in the U.S.
1.
Academic advisor.
2.
ACE.
3.
Admissions office.
4.
All-nighter.
5.
Assignment.
6.
Assistantship.
7.
Audit.
8.
Bear.
9.
Be behind.
10.
Blue book.
11.
Break.
12.
Bring up.
13.
Brown nose.
14.
Cafeteria.
15.
Call the roll.
16.
Campus security.
17.
Carol.
18.
Cheating.
19.
Check out.
20.
Class roster.
21.
Closed out.
22.
Co-ed. Co-educational.
23.
Commencement.
24.
Counselor.
25.
Course.
26.
Course request.
27.
Cram.
28.
Credit.
29.
Cut class.
30.
Dean's list.
31.
Declare.
32.
Dissertation.
33.
Dorm. Dormitory.
34.
Drop.
35.
Drop out.
36.
Elective. Optional course.
37.
Enroll.
38.
Excused absence.
39.
Faculty member.
40.
Field trip.
41.
Fill in the blank.
42.
Final exam.
43.
Flunk.
44.
Flunk out.
45.
Fraternity.
46.
Freshman.
47.
Get behind.
48.
Get caught up.
49.
Graduate student.
50.
Grant.
51.
Hand back.
52.
Handout.
53.
Head resident.
54.
Health center.
55.
Hit the books.
56.
Incomplete.
57.
Instructor.
58.
Interlibrary loan.
59.
Internship.
60.
Junior.
61.
Keep grades up.
62.
Lab. Laboratory.
63.
Lab assistant.
64.
Learning assistant center.
65.
Library fine.
66.
Lost and claim.
67.
Lower division course.
68.
Makeup test.
69.
Mickey Mouse course.
70.
Midterm.
71.
Miss. Class.
72.
Multiple choice test.
73.
Objective test.
74.
Off campus.
75.
Office hours.
76.
On probation.
77.
On reserve.
78.
Open book test.
79.
Orientation.
80.
Override.
81.
Paper.
82.
Pass back.
83.
Placement office.
84.
Plagiarize.
85.
Pop quiz.
86.
Prerequisite.
87.
Presentation.
88.
Prompt.
89.
Quad.
90.
Quarter.
91.
Quiz.
92
registrar,
93
registration,
94
research assistant,
95
resident advisor,
96
review session,
97
room and board,
98
roommate,
99
section,
100
semester,
101
senior,
102
short essay test,
103
shuttle,
104
sign up,
105
skip class,
106
skull session,
107
snap course,
108
sophomore,
109
sorority,
110
spring break,
111
stacks,
112
stipend,
113
student services,
114
student union,
115
study lounge,
116
teaching assistant, TA,
117
test,
118
turn in,
119
undergraduates, undergrad,
120
upper division,
121
work study.
Goodbye.
And good luck!
This is Mark Galley wishing all the students good luck.
การอัดเสียงได้จบลงเพียงแค่นี้ขอนักศึกษาฟังหลายๆครั้งก็จะได้ประโยชน์เองขอให้ประสบความสำเร็จทุกประการด้วยความปรารถนาดีจากพวกเราทุกคนสวัสดีครับ
End of recording. I wish you all the best while studying English.